Welcome to Sounds of Resistance channel. The turmoil in Ukraine is getting more complicated and unlivable for the Russians with each passing day. Especially in the first days of February 24, the Russian army marching to Kiev with songs of victory is only facing losses these days. The Ukrainian armed forces stormed over the bases established by the Russian army in the occupied regions. Vladimir Putin, on the other hand, did not think that the Ukrainian armed forces could carry out these operations. Moscow, which has not shared its military losses with its people since March, cannot prevent the loss of Russian soldiers. While the Western states were talking about the losses between 70 and 100,000 in the Russian army with their objective analysis, the Kremlin administration was reluctant to reveal the losses in Ukraine to its people. The Kremlin announced its latest update 6 months ago with funny numbers. However, as the heavy losses in the war gradually hit all the Russian people, the level of anger and hatred in the country began to increase. Russian President Vladimir Putin's decision to mobilize was actually the most official and definitive sign that the Russian army had suffered huge losses. The Russian army had entered Ukraine with an army of about 200,000 soldiers and occasionally sent reinforcements. The declaration of mobilization despite the 200,000-strong Russian army was a sign that the loss of soldiers in the Russian army had reached gigantic proportions. The confession made by an FSB officer this week shocked the Russian people. The FSB admitted that Russia's losses in the war exceeded 90,000 people. This dreadful figure seems far beyond what Putin was afraid to admit. At the same time, it causes a very serious reaction among the Russian people. Russia's irreparable losses in the war against Ukraine amount more than 90,000 people. In fact, the source cites the words of a current FSB officer and a former officer of the Special Services of the Russian Federation. It is stated that irreversible losses include people who died, disappeared, died by injury, or were injured. The source's information is close to estimates previously given by the Pentagon and British intelligence. In August, the Pentagon said between 70,000 and 80,000 Russian soldiers had been killed or wounded since the start of the war. British Defense Secretary Ben Wallace said in September that the total losses of the Russian army exceeded 80,000 people, of which about 25,000 people were killed. Earlier, the White House had previously estimated the losses of the Russian armed forces at 75,000 soldiers. However, the fact that the last confession is much higher than these figures shows how serious a problem the Kremlin is facing. With these losses, it is understood how important Vladimir Putin's call for mobilization, taking into account the popular support, is. After the announcement of the mobilization, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu admitted that, in fact, wounded soldiers were sent back to the front to Ukraine. This is another issue that needs attention. Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu actually admitted that wounded soldiers were being sent back to the front in Ukraine. Intelligence has repeatedly reported that due to the heavy losses of the Russian Federation, after minimal rehabilitation, the soldiers were again involved in hostilities. The press reported that those who did not want to return to the front were not given a disability certificate or were deprived of benefits. Shoigu claimed that 5,937 soldiers died and 90% of the wounded returned to duty, especially in Ukraine. The ministry has not updated its casualty figures since March 25, when it reported 1,351 dead and 3,825 injured. At the same time, the head of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation announced the same number of casualties as a number of media outlets collecting data on casualties in open sources. He noted that Russia's actual casualties in Ukraine were much greater because authorities classified the data, information on the dead had to be collected. As reported, Vladimir Putin declared partial mobilization to send Russian citizens to war. In a speech, Putin said that in the 7th month of the war in Ukraine, partial mobilization is necessary for the Russian Federation to protect the homeland. However, this homeland is not seen as a homeland by Russian citizens. There is a great unrest among the Russian people after the final decision of Vladimir Putin. This unrest is fed by riots and protests. The voice of the Russian people is starting to get louder. The conscription of more men and the talk of nuclear weapons offend the citizens. President Vladimir Putin's massive military mobilization and the growing talk about nuclear weapons in the protracted Ukraine conflict are troubling many Russians, including the urban elite, where the war seems so far behind. In some city centers, apartments are being offered for sale or rented at fire sale prices, as hundreds of thousands of Russian men have left the country since Putin ordered reserve officers to be called in for production, according to real estate experts. In other words, new troops to fight in Ukraine are dealing blows to the Russian ecosystem. About half of Russians said they were alarmed and scared after Putin announced the draft, while another 13% said they felt anger, according to a survey of 1,631 people last month by the Levada Center, a non-governmental sociological research organization. It is stated that people over the age of 18 in urban and rural areas of 50 regions are very seriously rebelling against Putin. Most men say they don't want to go to Ukraine and be cannon fodder. The general discourse is that Russian men do not want to sacrifice their lives for Putin's fantasies. A survey published by the State Public Opinion Foundation at the same time as the Levada survey also showed that the prevailing mood among Russians is now unrest, according to 70% of the 1,500 respondents. Now, it is very unusual for our country and a new collective psychotrauma. Ekaterina Kolesnikova, director of Northwest, a private research center for management practices and social political mood research, said in her post. Unrest, particularly among wealthy urban Russians who are somewhat protected from a war in which most of those killed come from poorer areas, threatens to erode support for Putin, according to some experts who follow Russia's domestic politics. Both Western Kremlin observers and many Russian political analysts who support Putin say public discontent with the Russian president's policies is unlikely to lead him astray or undermine his control. But observers of Russia's political landscape say dissatisfaction threatens to spread and that Kremlin is watching Vladimir Putin's approval ratings closely. Policy analysts have noted that, while many Russians are willing to tolerate the president's restrictions on political freedoms, they do so with the understanding that their lives and well-being will not be destabilized. In other words, the Russians are actually developing a move for their own homeland defense, but they're also aware that Putin is leading them to the apocalypse. Many people feel disappointed or even deceived in some way, in the sense that they did not expect things to change in this way. Of course, this undermines their confidence in the Russian leadership, both in the short run and the long run. Presidential spokesman Dmitry Peskov recently said that it is understandable that the current event will trigger some uneasy feelings, but that the Kremlin does not see much polarization in Russian society. In the continuation of his statements, Peskov also stated that there was a unity among the Russian people. However, this has been interpreted as an indication that the Kremlin is living in a purely fantasy world. A number of issues are contributing to the growing unrest. Analysts said the annexation of Ukrainian territory without Russia taking full control, the failures on the battlefield that allowed Ukraine to regain ground, and Vladimir Putin's threats to use nuclear weapons fueled public uncertainty and cast doubt on the soundness of the Kremlin strategy. One of the prevailing concerns, according to analysts, is the recent mobilization, which has left several segments of the population untouched. The call, officially called partial mobilization, has a wide reach, hitting homes in many cities. It includes, among other criteria, men with previous military service or specialization, and those currently in reserve, according to official state media. Early in the war, Vladimir Putin promised that only professional military personnel would participate in what the Kremlin calls a special military operation. However, this promise was not kept. As a result, when we look at today, Putin is experiencing a big failure in terms of professional soldiers. Putin said mobilization efforts will be completed in 2 weeks and no further calls are planned at this time. Of a planned 300,000 men draft, 222,000 have been mobilized, he said, and 16,000 have already carried out combat missions. But the credibility of Putin's words is also questionable, and the Russian people now trust their leaders much less than they used to. As long as the Russian military losses in Ukraine continue, Putin will find himself in a much bigger grip, and there is no chance to call for a new mobilization, because he knows that if he makes such a call, he will lose his seat. Thanks for watching.